My wife roasts coffee, and so she makes her own blend. So she gets 4 different kinds of beans, and she roasts them all, and she puts them in their own separate containers. And when you open the first container and smell it, you go, okay, I know what that is. And you open up the second one, you can't smell the next 3. Your nasal passages are done after the first one because it's a fairly heavy aroma. And then when you go back and smell them the opposite way, you get a whole new set of perceptions. And it's the same way with tubes, power tubes, preamp tubes, speakers, cabinet woods, strings.
When we did it with microphones, in solo, everybody preferred the really bright microphones. They're always like, oh, that's the best sounding. As soon as we put it in a track, those cheaper, brighter microphones, instead of having full body and rich, they just heard a little, they just stick out. Mm-hmm. And then you go back and listen to it with fresh ears and solo again, and you start going, oh no, I don't like that anymore. And we found that when we did 12 mics with 21 people, the U47 won, but the SM7 came in everybody's top 4.
Probably isn't because it's so special.
Yeah.
It's probably because it's a little less special and it's more palatable across the board.
Yeah, it was in everybody's top 4. So it was $450. The U47 at that time was a $20,000 mic, probably even more.
A microphone that has a real specific characteristic that's pleasing, that's great, that's just got the perfect upper mid-range balance, it's ideal. You'll focus in on that, but if you hear something that hits you on 4 or 5 different parameters all simultaneously, you'll overall like that one better because it's just, I don't want to use the word mediocre, but it just by being less specialized and more even across the bandwidth, it's just more pleasing experience overall. And then you would naturally, more people would be more likely to pick that one.
Yeah, so I'm wondering then, with that philosophy on amps.
Absolutely, with tubes, sure.
So listening to different tubes and deciding.
Oh yeah, for example, the Tungsol 12AX7, it's really an excellent tube. It's one of the best Russian 12AX7s available as far as sound and reliability and quiet performance and all that. You get sick of it after about an hour.
Really?
It's just got this top end openness and clarity and detail that after a while, it's just damn annoying. You could also expose some deficiencies in the amp that you're using in. It isn't necessarily compatible with that amp. A JCM 800 will sound a little extra brittle with that tube.
I find those amps very brittle anyways.
Yeah, and so
it's not a good cooling class.
And you don't want to put that tube in V1 because then it'll be extra claw. I call it claw. It'll be extra in your face and unbearable after a while. Where something like a JJ might actually make that amp sound a little warmer because it's a little fatter sounder tube and a little more transparent on the top. It's not everybody's favorite idea of a 12AX7, but again, it's low microphonic, it's reliable, it's generally really quiet, and it'll cure certain ills in certain amplifiers.
Oh, I see.
And that's why across manufacturers...
So there's a science of tuning the right tubes, the right valves for your amp.
It's absolutely that. And that's why you'll see across manufacturers, one manufacturer will swear by the JJs, and another one will go, well, not so fast. Right? And we've always used the Shuguang, the Chinese 12AX7s in most of the positions of our amps, because I find them to be more balanced overall. They also tend to be a little bit more microphonic from batch to batch. So we don't use them in every stage of the amp, only the ones where they're less critical. And then we'll put a specialized one in the very first stage, the V1 stage. So that will be in an amp that works well with the Tungsol, we'll put it in that amp because it just gives it a nice sheen on the top. Another amp like the Ultra Lead, which is more of an aggressive amp that's got a lot of bottom end and a lot of top end clarity, we wouldn't put that tube in that amp. We'd put something a little bit more rounded on the top in the first stage. Otherwise, it will accentuate that idea among some people about our amps that they're hard to play, they're unforgiving. What they mean is, I can hear every single mistake I make. It makes me sound like a crap player. So they won't want that. Other people will want that because when I play a really complex chord with all that overdrive, I still hear
all the voicings.
The voicing and the individual note.
So talking to amps,
there's
Let's see what you've got. I like the fact you got a custom built PA 100 sitting down there.
This was the subject of a recent video we did called "The High Watt from Hell." This belongs to Dave Friedman, and he knows I'm a high watt nut. And he bought this for a song, and somebody had turned it from a PA amp into a DR103, the 100-watt guitar head, and did a horrible job of it. And we had done a previous show examining his favorite amp that all of his amps sort of spring from, a 68 Plexi JMP. The funny thing about it is when we first met, he brought it to me and said, "Can you have a look at this?" And I said, "Sure." So I worked on it and I gave it back to him and he said, "Sound great. What did you do?" And I said, "I put it back to stock and then biased it properly." So that was like 30 years ago. A couple of weeks ago, we started talking. He was a guest on our show and we started talking about that amp. And he goes, "Actually, you're the guy that made it sound good when I first got it." And I'd forgotten all about it. So we got that. We brought it to the shop. We tore it apart. We did a big rundown on it, examined the insides and why it behaves the way it does and why Dave likes the way it is, even though it's not 100% stock. And so when I went over to his shop to drop that off, he says, "I got a project for you if you want." And I said, "Okay, what is it?" And he says, he pointed to this and he says, "I want you to put your favorite iteration of DR103 in there because whatever's in there now isn't cutting it." And somebody had tried to make it overdrive and all this, and it was pretty hideous. So we did a show on that. And I rebuilt it into a 1972-74 era DR103. That's why that's here. We were just playing with it and messing with it, and we did some video stuff on it.
How does it sound now?
It sounds like a real DR103 the way it should sound. It has the kerrang, it has the natural bloom into distortion, such as high watts are. They have to be turned up, pretty much all the way.
Oh yes, to get them to distort, yes.
Right, which is of course where the power station comes in. We can dial that down and make it tolerable, but it also is instructive to hear the thing operating wide open so you can hear the room reflection, the wallop of the string attack and all that. Just sort of get a feel of, is it right?
Does this have an IR loader in it as well?
This does not.
Which is the one that does?
That's the power load.
Power load, right.
This is
I see over there.
This is the power, right. This is the power station, PS100, which is the 100-watt power station with the 2 selectable channels. So like a vintage amp that doesn't have anything but volume controls and away you go. Like a JMP, like a 70 JMP, for example, and you want it to be a clean amp and an overdriven amp at the same time. And you would normally just do that by turning your guitar volume, except when you turn the guitar volume all the way up,
it's brighter.
Right. So with this configuration, you set the volumes up high and turn your guitar way down so you get a nice clean sound out of it, out of the amp. You hear all the character and the sparkle and all of that, but at a manageable volume, whatever your playing volume is going to be. Then you switch to this channel and turn the volume way down and turn your guitar all the way up. And now you're still at the same volume level, but now the amp is full bore raging. And that's the benefit of having the 2 channels. It's really more optimized for live playing than studio playing. In the studio, you really don't need that switching capability. You can just set it for the track, the pass that you're going to do, and then set it differently for another round, right?
Yeah.
So, but in live performance, having that feature and the 100-watt output, which guys that routinely play 100-watt amps are just so used to that spank that a 50-watt won't quite cut it. The PS2 is the 50-watt version, which only has the single row of controls.
Yep.
And most of the time you're attenuating, keeping the volume down. And again, you just want to be able to set the reactive load so you get the behavior you want, similar to what the speaker cabinet gives to the amp. And then dial it in with the depth and presence controls. And that does 90% of what that does on a practical level and doesn't have the remote foot switching capability. This one's $899 and that one's $999. So this is really the ideal unit for all around sort of work. This is a more specialized tool for live rigs where you've got a couple of amps and a couple of different presets that you want to.
We're talking about. I want to hear some things. That'd be fun.
Okay, we can get to, and then the power load is the reactive load of the power station only with an IR loader in it. It doesn't control the volume of the speaker.
And it comes with IRs, and you can load your own.
That's right.
Great.
That's right.
That I love.
It also has an analog cab sim in it, which anybody will tell you that analog cabs are obsolete. Well, they're not. They're actually very useful for clean sounds. When you're getting into overdrive and stuff, it's nice to have that speaker model to sort of smooth out and homogenize the ratty harmonics generated by just highly distorted amplifiers. So that gives it that sort of ringing, smooth, saturated sound, which an analog cab sim isn't really good at doing because it's just an analog filter. It's not a model of the speaker in the cab with the grill cloth and the mic that you chose and the room environment that you're in. That's a whole different kettle of fish. But when you're doing clean tracks, all that speaker modeling stuff is much, much less important than what pickups and strings sound like and what your pick attack is like, the passage that you're trying to play, and what specific sort of character that you want that track to be. It isn't so dependent on how much of it is amp behavior. It's more dependent on your interaction with the guitar. So there are times when an analog cab sim is superior to an IR, and that's why the power load has both.
Nice.
And you can run them both out simultaneously. On top of this, we have our reintroduced Sound City.
Oh yeah, I wanted to ask you a bit about that.
It's an interesting dog because when we reintroduced them, I went back to the very early David Reeves design and just refined that a little bit and released the first model as that. There's a character about the original Sound City amp that he designed for Sound City that was the predecessor to the Hiwatt DR103.
Right.
A little bit more of a raw character to it, but still a really viable amp. As you can tell by listening to Live at Leeds, those were all the original David Reeves designed Sound City 100s that they were playing through.
Oh, well.
Not including Ant Whistle. They all played through them. Sound City heads and Sound City cabinets with fan speakers in them, and they're the original Sound Cities. Then Reeves left Sound City, launched Hiwatt, maintained his association with Pete Townsend, and then evolved the amps to be clearer and crisper and cleaner under the most punishing conditions, and probably egged along by Pete Townsend, who was really into the Fender sound, but only bigger and louder and more and more and more. I incorporated some of that original gnarl of the original Sound City 100 model. Had a gold, you can see roughly what it looks like here, this gold front panel with the microwave knobs on it. That was the original amp that he made for Sound City. And I took that and just evolved it a little bit into the current model. So that's what this is. I'm using this as a preheater for 6L6s that we're loading into the PS2s for this week's production. And the reason we preheat them is because in the matching and testing process, which is done by the intermediate suppliers that we buy from, and we buy from them to get tested match tubes so that they eliminate all the garbage. So in the middle of all that, when they're testing the tubes, they don't heat them up very long. They probably put them in their testing gear for a minute or two, just long enough for the filaments.
But not as long as you're doing. How long are you doing?
Half an hour to an hour minimum. We want everything in there at the proper operating temperature because you're going to get a much more accurate match doing that. But they've done all the basic work of getting rid of the defects and getting reasonably close matched pairs on a computer matching system. So they're relatively accurate. But once they warm up, they can drift. And sometimes they just drift a milliamp or two and it's no big deal.
Right.
Sometimes they'll drift 30 milliamps and that's a big deal. So we occasionally find a pair that these are rated with a plate current of 31 milliamps under their test conditions. Our test conditions, the voltage is a little different than theirs. So our number will come out a little different.
What does your number come out as?
In this particular application, they might be between 3 and 5 milliamps hotter because our plate voltage is about a few percent higher than theirs. So our number will come in a little higher, but it still should be the same on each tube.
Right.
On this particular pair, this one came in at 31 and it's labeled 31. This one is labeled 31 and it came in at 60.
Wow.
So that's what happens after they cook. Here's another pair. This one came in at 30.
Yep.
They rated it 31. The same tube with the same readings, 31, came in at 43.
Wow. Those are huge differences.
That's a huge difference. Now, that only happens maybe one time out of 50 tubes. If it starts happening more often, then we have to go back to them and go, could you cook the tubes a little longer before you do the test? These last couple of years has really strained that system because so many people are demanding whatever tubes are available to be shipped as quickly as possible. So they're basically running faster and warming them up less and just trying to fulfill orders. So you start to see this bigger discrepancy from one batch to the next. And that's just the nature of the business right now. Go ahead and turn it all the way up. I often use the drop D to play really clean passages to hear all the resonance.
I see. See how much different is this volume? How dramatic is this?
It's not dramatic.
Not dramatic?
It's subtle. There's two things happening here. We're setting the resonance of the high frequency and low frequency peaks of the reactive load, which is in effect changing the speaker characteristic.
Yeah.
And then we're dialing in the power amp on the top and bottom end to just sort of fine tune.
Okay.
So these have a dramatic impact on the sound. This is flat. It's not reactive at all. It's just resistive load now.
Yeah.
And then the middle is a medium amount of reactive behavior in the low and high register. And then this is wide open.
Yeah. God bless it. That's fantastic.
We're going to start with this one turned off now. Like this, I've got the master all the way up. I'm starting out with the gain, the volume knob down, the preamp volume's down. So I think...
So it drives pretty early on.
This one has a little bit more saturated and smoother overdrive characteristic than this, which was also a characteristic of the original first production of Sound City.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely got that 2K,
Right.
that sponginess.
Yeah.
That's great. I like it with that a lot because it, I don't sonically, well, we've got all these settings, haven't we?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So we put it back flat. That's crazy. So, how's the master work though? If we ignore that for a second,
It pretty much works like the high watt master, which is a volume for the other two volumes. It's not all that.
It's not doing anything with the power amp section though, because characteristically, I was always told, and I could be wrong, usually am. The thing with Marshalls was like how hard you hit those power amp section. That was such a big part of the sound. And so lots of early people hated the master volume amps because they felt like it just didn't do that same thing. Now, that could just be mumbo jumbo. But
that's partly true because in the earlier amps, they didn't have very much gain in the same way these amps didn't have very much gain.
Right.
And then the later Marshalls had more front end gain, so they had more signal to push up against the master volume.
Okay.
And then you meter out how much of that you want to get to the power amp. And of course, the later Marshalls, they progressively lowered the plate voltage to extend the life of the power tubes, to reduce warranty claims, to make things, also to introduce a little bit more power amp saturation at more tolerable volume levels than before.
Okay.
So all those things just sort of work in
So there's no way to
tandem.
stick the master attenuation at the very end after the power amp? So you could hit the power amp super hard?
That's what this is doing.
That's what that's doing. Okay.
Right. So the only difference is the master, the preamp stage of the Marshall design has a stage called a cathode follower that drives the tone stack. That cathode follower had its own unique character of overdrive when you pushed it to a certain point. So in that sense, if you put enough gain in the very front end and then hit that cathode follower and turn the master volume down, you would get more sustain and saturation at lower volumes. But still, you're not hitting the power amp very hard until you turn the master up to where you hear that you're hearing the power amp. You can hear the compression start to come into play as you turn it up, and you'll hear that in the same way you'll hear that on this. I'm going to turn this up gradually. You'll hear the point where you can hear the power amp start to max out. You'll actually hear it. It'll start flattening out and getting a little thicker and smoother on the top. It just got fatter and thicker. It didn't necessarily get so much louder. It just got fatter and thicker. It doesn't get louder until you're up here.
Right.
But you're also going to get a lot more compression now.
So what's your preferred thing? To keep this open and then control it here?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
That's the way I generally do it.
Yeah. Makes sense to have the attenuation at the very end. Right.
But really depends on the guitar and the song you're playing and all that.
Sure.
I mean, it's nonstop, you know.
Totally.
The thing I always liked about the David Reeves designs was that when you do play clean like that, you have that sparkly mid-range characteristic that you don't normally hear in Marshalls.
Missing string. Missing string. Missing string.
Yeah, well,
5-string wonder.
well, after that bit of shaming, I'll finally get around to putting the string that I broke 2 years ago on.
2 years ago. So we just were checking out this this combo here with a separate power amp.
This is the Ether combo. It was just a kind of a what if project. I kind of projected myself into 1946.
But what was the pretense of having the power amp separate? Just to break down the weights? You got two things to carry, or so you could change out the power amp? So
There was no logic. There was me going, if I was Leo Fender in 1946 and I saw what he was doing,
right.
what would I try to do to put as much distance between what I think is a cool way to do something and what he thought was a cool way to do something? And I also had the benefit of being here now, and we were involved in rack system development, you know, from the mid 80s and all the way through until the present day. And so I started thinking, what about a component system? I also think about the experience of setting up gear when you're getting ready for a gig. There's sort of a moment in there for me when I'm getting things set up, I'm shutting out the outside world, and I'm trying to create my little creative space.
Yeah, so this is what we're talking about. A separate amp here, separate power amp.
When you're doing that, you'll occasionally get somebody that comes up to the stage and goes, oh, that's a cool rig, or what are you using there, and blah, 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 blah. And so I'm imagining how much that will twist somebody's head trying to figure out how that fits into the whole scheme of things. So when I first started it, it started out as a Facebook project. It was just basically to show, besides being in manufacturing and doing everything with CAD and blah, 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 we can still do things with hand tools and imagination. And so let's make a project out of doing something just out of pure stream of consciousness. We'll start from the premise that we don't know what it's going to come out, and we're not going to spend any money on it. We're going to use whatever we have laying around. So I rummaged around for parts, chassis, scrap transformers, miscellaneous odds and ends. And so as it started to come about, then I started getting a sense of, well, you know what? This could be an amp. We could make it look really early era always sort of thought, what would we do if our logo was a script logo? What would that look like? And so Erico designed a script logo, and then it all sort of came together. And then after we had the prototypes didn't look as nice as this. It was just a box with a speaker in it, a box with a preamp in it, bolted to the back, and a box with power tubes sticking out of it. David Torton came over to the factory. He happened to be in town, and he stopped by to just say hello. He was doing a gig in Pasadena. I had the prototype bits and pieces all wired together. What's that? Well, here, I don't know. You play through it and you tell me. And he played through it and he went, when are you going to make this? And I said, there was never any plan to make it. It was just that project. And he says, no, this has to be a real product. It's amazing. I want one. So then we decided to start figuring out how it would look. And then I thought, since we're probably not going to make more than 5.
How many have you made?
We've made 50.
50 or 15?
50.
50, nice.
And
how much are you selling them for?
They're $49.99. It uses a specially designed Fane Alnico 12. They weren't going to make an Alnico at the time, and I contacted them and said, "Look, I need an Alnico with a cream." This is before Celestion came out with their Alnico cream. I need an Alnico that sounds like a Fane speaker with a cream chassis. And this is what it needs to be, and blah, 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 blah. And a couple of samples back and forth, and we had it.
Where are Fane made these days?
They're made in UK.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Good.
So these are a handmade speaker.
Great.
So I just thought, okay, we put the power amp in one box, the preamp in another box, and now how do we get them to talk to each other? We have a cable, 2 cables, 3 cables. We have the power cable for the power amp, which is also the power supply, which is also the power supply for the preamp. So we have the umbilical cable that connects the power unit to the preamp, and then power goes up here to supply the voltage to all the tubes. Signal from the preamp comes back down the cord into here to be amplified by the power amp, which then comes out the speaker output and back into the cabinet. How convenient, huh?
Nice.
The beauty of it is that the power unit doesn't weigh a lot differently than the cabinet, so they're very light to carry.
That's amazing.
They're fun to hook up, and if somebody comes up to you at a gig when you're setting up, they're looking at this, they're going to go, what the hell's that? And then you're going to start explaining to them, and then they're going to go like this. Okay, don't tell me anymore, let's just hear it. And when they hear it, they'll go, oh, okay, I see what you did there.